I never thought I'd be the one to call the cops on my own brother. But here we are. The moment I hit that dial, I felt a pit in my stomach, like something in me was breaking beyond repair. But let's rewind a bit, because you need to understand the full mess I found myself in. A few weeks ago, I got a call from my older brother Jake. We hadn't spoken in months, and I was honestly relieved by the silence. Jake has always been the black sheep of the family, the one who just couldn't get his life together. I, on the other hand, was the golden child, the one who worked hard, stayed out of trouble, and built a respectable career as a systems engineer. At 35, I'd managed to secure a comfortable life, even earning a security clearance for my job, which was no small feat. Jake, on the other hand, was 37 and still bouncing between dead-end jobs, getting into fights, and somehow always needing a quick fix of cash. So when his name popped up on my phone, I knew it wasn't a social call. Sure enough, he was asking for money. $2,000 to be exact. I tried to keep it civil, asked him what it was for, but all I got was the usual sob story. Bills, overdue rent, some vague threats from sketchy people he apparently owed. I knew better than to fall for it. The last time I lent him money, he blew it all on a weekend bender and ghosted me for months. "I'm sorry, Jake," I said, trying to sound firm but not heartless. "I can't help you this time. You need to figure this out on your own." I thought that was the end of it, but I underestimated just how desperate Jake had become. A few days later, I came home from work to find my house in chaos. Drawers pulled out, paper scattered, and the unmistakable emptiness where my valuables used to be. At first, I thought it was just some random burglary, but then I checked the footage from my Tesla Sentry Mode camera, which was pointed right at my front door. There he was, clear as day. Jake, breaking into my house in broad daylight. He wasn't even trying to hide his face. I watched in disbelief as my own brother rifled through my stuff, taking cash, my collection of valuable watches, and even my custom-built mechanical keyboard, a piece I'd spent hours perfecting. I was furious. Hurt, yes, but mostly just furious. This wasn't some desperate cry for help. This was a blatant betrayal. I called our parents, hoping for some kind of support or, at the very least, a rational explanation. But instead of shock or anger, all I got was a tired sigh from my mother. "Why didn't you just give him the money when he asked?" she said, as if this whole mess was somehow my fault. "You know how Jake is. If you'd helped him out, none of this would have happened." I was speechless. Here I was, the victim of a literal crime, and they were acting like I was the one in the wrong. My dad chimed in, saying I should just let it go. That family is family, and I needed to forgive Jake. They even suggested, no, actually encouraged, that I pay Jake the $2,000 he originally asked for, as if that would somehow make him return my stolen belongings. That was the last straw. I had spent my entire life cleaning up after Jake's messes, always being the responsible one, while he dragged our family's name through the mud. But this was crossing a line I didn't even know existed. I told my parents, as calmly as I could manage, that Jake had 24 hours to return everything he took, or I was going to the police. They didn't believe me. They actually laughed. My mother even said, "You wouldn't do that to your own brother," with the smug certainty that I would back down, just like every other time. But this wasn't just about the money or the things he stole. This was about respect. Respect for my home, my boundaries, my life. I gave Jake a call, giving him one last chance to set things right. I was met with the same dismissive attitude. "What are you going to do, huh? Call the cops on your own brother?" he sneered, clearly confident that I'd never go through with it. But he was wrong. I was done being the family's doormat. I hung up, took a deep breath, and called the police. Calling the police on my own brother was one of the hardest things I've ever done, but I knew it had to be done. As I waited for the officers to arrive, my mind was racing. I kept replaying Jake's smug voice in my head, challenging me to take action. Part of me was still hoping he would show up at the last minute, throw the stolen items at my feet, and beg for forgiveness. But deep down, I knew that wasn't going to happen. Jake had never faced real consequences for his actions, and I was about to change that. The officers were polite but thorough. I showed them the Tesla Sentry footage, handed over an inventory of everything that was missing, and filled out a detailed report. I could see the disbelief in their eyes when they realized it was my own brother who had broken in. They even asked me twice if I was sure I wanted to press charges. I could almost hear my mother's voice in my head, urging me to be the bigger person and let it go. But I was done letting things go. This time, Jake had gone too far. The next day, the police came knocking on Jake's door. From what I heard, he was completely blindsided. He tried to talk his way out of it, saying it was just a misunderstanding, that he was just borrowing some things. But the footage didn't lie, and neither did the evidence. They found my watches in his apartment, along with the cash he stole. As for my custom keyboard, he had already pawned it off for a fraction of its value. Jake was arrested on the spot. I thought I'd feel a sense of satisfaction, seeing him finally face the music. But all I felt was a deep, hollow sadness. It's a strange feeling, betraying your own blood. But I knew there was no other way. If I let him off the hook this time, it would just be another notch in his belt of bad decisions. The news of Jake's arrest spread quickly through our family like wildfire. My phone blew up with calls and texts, all of them from my parents. They were furious. "How could you do this to your own brother?" My mother screamed into the phone. "You know he has a record. You've ruined his life." She was sobbing, but all I could think was, "No, Mom. Jake ruined his own life." I tried to explain that Jake had crossed a line, that he had broken into my house and stolen from me, but it was like talking to a brick wall. My parents had always had a blind spot when it came to Jake. They were willing to excuse anything he did, no matter how outrageous, while holding me to impossible standards. It had always been like that. Jake was the reckless, charming one who could do no wrong, while I was the responsible one who could never be good enough. But this time, I was standing my ground. I told my parents that I wasn't backing down, that Jake needed to face the consequences of his actions, and that I was prepared to testify against him in court. My mother's response was to accuse me of betraying the family. "You've always been jealous of Jake," she spat. "You were just trying to ruin his life because you're miserable in your own." That one stung. I'd heard variations of that accusation my whole life, but it still hurt coming from my own mother. It was like she couldn't see past her idealized version of Jake, the golden boy who could do no wrong, even when he was stealing from his own brother. My father wasn't any better. He tried to play the mediator, but his idea of making peace was for me to drop the charges and pretend none of this had happened. "Come on, son, we're family," he said, as if that excused everything. "Just let it go, for the sake of your mother." I was beyond done with their excuses. For once in my life, I wasn't going to back down. I told them that unless Jake returned every single item he stole and apologized, I would see this through to the end, no matter what it cost me. My dad just sighed and hung up, clearly convinced I was being unreasonable. The following days were a whirlwind of emotions. Part of me kept questioning whether I had done the right thing. I mean, how messed up is it to be the reason your own brother goes to jail? But every time those doubts crept in, I reminded myself of what was at stake. My job, my security clearance, my peace of mind. All of it was on the line if I let Jake's actions slide. I couldn't afford to be associated with someone who had no respect for the law or other people's boundaries. A week later, I was called in to testify at Jake's preliminary hearing. I could feel the weight of my parents' disappointment bearing down on me as I walked into the courtroom. They were sitting in the front row, glaring at me like I was a criminal. But I kept my head high, knowing that I was doing what had to be done. I told the truth, plain and simple, and the evidence spoke for itself. Jake's lawyer tried to paint me as the bitter, jealous brother who wanted to ruin his life. But the footage, the stolen items, the police report, it all painted a different picture. Jake was remanded into custody, awaiting trial, and I walked out of that courtroom feeling both lighter and heavier at the same time. The fallout at home was immediate and brutal. My parents stopped talking to me altogether, and when they did, it was only to hurl accusations and guilt trips my way. My mother even went as far as to tell me that I was no longer welcome at family gatherings, that I had chosen my career over my own blood. But the truth is, I hadn't chosen my career over my brother. I'd chosen my sanity, my safety, my future. And if that meant losing my family in the process, then so be it. The days after Jake's arrest were a blur of legal meetings and tense conversations. My parents doubled down on their campaign to guilt me into dropping the charges. They even brought in reinforcements, my aunts, uncles, and cousins. It seemed like every relative within a 100-mile radius was suddenly calling to tell me how I was tearing the family apart. "You're really going to send your own brother to jail over some stuff," one cousin lectured. "This isn't what family does. We take care of each other, no matter what." But where was that support when Jake was breaking into my house, stealing everything I'd worked for? Where was that loyalty when I was the one being wronged? It became clear that to them, family only meant covering for Jake, no matter how low he sank. I was expected to sacrifice my peace, my safety, and even my future just to keep the facade of a happy family intact. The tension with my parents reached a breaking point. My mother showed up at my house unannounced one evening, eyes red from crying. For a moment, I almost felt bad for her, almost. She begged me to reconsider, to think of how this would destroy Jake's life. "He's your brother. For God's sake," she wailed, clutching my arm like her life depended on it. I stayed firm, though my voice shook. "No, Mom. I'm done cleaning up his messes. I'm done sacrificing everything for someone who wouldn't think twice about throwing me under the bus." That's when she dropped the bombshell. "If you don't drop the charges, we're done with you. You'll be dead to this family." She spat, her voice venomous and cold. It was a side of her I had never seen before, or maybe I had just been blind to it all these years. Hearing my own mother disown me for doing the right thing was a gut punch, but it was also the final nail in the coffin. I realized then that I had been holding on to a fantasy of what family should be, not what mine actually was. They had chosen Jake over me, time and time again, and I was finally done pretending that would ever change. With my parents cutting me off, I braced myself for the trial. I knew it wouldn't be easy, especially since Jake had managed to hire a slick lawyer, probably paid for by my parents. The lawyer tried every trick in the book, from painting Jake as a misguided soul who just needed help, to portraying me as the heartless brother who turned his back on family. The trial itself was a nightmare. Sitting in that courtroom, with my parents and half the family glaring daggers at me, felt like walking into a lion's den. But I was determined to see it through. I took the stand, recounting every detail of the break-in, presenting the Sentry footage, and describing the items that were stolen. The prosecutor was relentless in laying out the case, and the evidence was damning. Jake, for his part, sat there looking like a wounded puppy, as if he were the victim in all this. At one point, he even had the audacity to wink at me, as if we were just playing some elaborate game. It was infuriating, but I kept my composure. I was doing this not out of spite, but because someone had to finally hold him accountable. When the verdict came down, guilty on all counts, I felt a strange mix of relief and sorrow. Jake was sentenced to prison, and I knew it would be a long time before he would see the outside world again. The judge even made a point of emphasizing Jake's long history of criminal behavior, which made the sentence harsher. But instead of feeling triumphant, all I could see was the look of betrayal in my parents' eyes as they left the courtroom. My mother didn't even spare me a glance. She just stormed out, dragging my father along with her. In that moment, it hit me like a freight train. I had lost my family, all because I chose to stand up for myself. The aftermath was brutal. My phone was flooded with hateful messages from relatives, accusing me of ruining Jake's life. One particularly cruel text from an uncle read, "Hope you're happy now. You've destroyed this family. Don't ever show your face at another family gathering." I felt like I was living in an alternate reality, where I was the villain for wanting to protect what I had worked so hard to build. The worst part was a tiny voice in the back of my mind kept asking if they were right. Had I gone too far? Had I overreacted? But then I'd remind myself of the cold, hard truth. Jake wasn't some misguided teenager making bad choices. He was a grown man with a long history of hurting others and expecting everyone else to pick up the pieces. As much as it hurt, I decided to go no contact with my parents and anyone else who sided with Jake. It was like ripping off a bandage. Quick, painful, but ultimately necessary. I changed my phone number, blocked them on social media, and even moved to a new apartment to make it harder for them to find me. For the first time in a long while, I felt a sense of peace, but it was a lonely kind of peace. I had severed ties with the only family I had ever known, all because I refused to be an enabler. The holidays came and went in silence. No calls, no texts, no invites to family dinners. It was just me in my empty apartment. But as lonely as it was also liberating. I realized that I had been living under the weight of their expectations and manipulations for far too long. Losing my family was like shedding a toxic layer of skin, revealing a new, raw version of myself. I wasn't sure what the future held, but I knew one thing for sure. I was finally free. Free from the guilt. Free from the manipulation. Free to live my life on my own terms. And if that meant spending Christmas alone with a microwave dinner, so be it. At least it was my choice. But the peace didn't last long. Just when I thought I could finally move on, I got an unexpected visitor at my door. One that threatened to drag me back into the chaos I had fought so hard to escape. Just when I thought I could finally leave all the family drama behind, there was a knock on my door late one evening. I wasn't expecting anyone. My social circle had shrunk to nearly zero since I had gone no contact with my family, so it couldn't have been a friend. My first instinct was to ignore it. After everything that had happened, I didn't want any surprises. But the knocking persisted, louder and more desperate this time. Reluctantly, I opened the door, and there stood my mother. She looked disheveled, with tears streaming down her face, her eyes red and swollen, like she had been crying for hours. My first thought was that something terrible must have happened, maybe an accident or worse. But before I could even get a word out, she threw herself into my apartment, collapsing onto the floor in a heap of sobs. "Please, you have to help your brother," she cried, clutching at my pant leg like a lifeline. "They're going to ruin his life. They're going to lock him up for years." For a moment, I just stood there, frozen. I hadn't seen or heard from my parents since the trial, and now, here was my mother begging me for a favor. I felt a pang of guilt, the old familiar tug of family loyalty that I thought I had buried for good. But then, the anger bubbled up. Where was this desperation when Jake broke into my home? Where was this pleading when I was left to clean up his mess? I gently pried her hands off me and helped her to her feet, guiding her to the couch. I couldn't help but notice how much older she looked, as if the weight of Jake's actions had aged her overnight. She kept mumbling incoherently about lawyers' appeals and how Jake was facing serious time behind bars. Apparently, the judge had thrown the book at him, and with his prior record, he was looking at a lengthy sentence. "He's your brother," she kept repeating, like a broken record. "He made a mistake, but he's still family. You can't let him rot in prison." I took a deep breath, trying to keep my composure. "Mom, he didn't just make a mistake. He broke into my house, stole from me, and made me look like the bad guy for standing up for myself. I'm not going to risk everything I built just to bail him out again." But she wouldn't listen. She went on and on about how Jake had turned a corner this time, that he was finally ready to change if only I would give him one last chance. I wanted to believe her. God, I really did. But I'd heard this story too many times before. The endless cycle of Jake messing up, my parents cleaning up his mess, and then expecting everyone else to forgive and forget. When I finally got a word in, I told her flat out, "No, I'm not going to drop the charges, and I'm not going to pay for any fancy lawyers. Jake needs to face the consequences of his actions. Maybe this time, he'll actually learn something. That's when her demeanor shifted. The desperate, pleading mother was gone, replaced by a cold, steely glare that sent chills down my spine. "You think you're so perfect, don't you?" she hissed, her voice low and venomous. "Just because you've got a good job in a fancy house. You think you're better than the rest of us." I was taken aback. I had never heard her speak to me like that before. It was as if all the resentment she had bottled up over the years had finally erupted. "This is your fault," she continued, jabbing a finger at my chest. "You're the reason Jake's life is ruined. If you had just given him the money, none of this would have happened." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. It was like she had completely rewritten history in her mind, turning me into the villain of the story. I felt my blood boil, but I forced myself to stay calm. "I'm done being your scapegoat, Mom. You and Dad made Jake into who he is by never holding him accountable. You're the ones who let him get away with everything, not me." Her face twisted into a mask of fury, and for a moment, I thought she might actually hit me. But instead, she spat out one final line that would haunt me for weeks. "I hope you're happy. You've destroyed this family. I never want to see you again." And with that, she stormed out, slamming the door behind her so hard that the walls shook. I stood there, shell-shocked, trying to process what had just happened. I had lost my family, not because of what Jake had done, but because I refused to enable his behavior any longer. That night, I couldn't sleep. My mother's words kept replaying in my mind like a broken record. Was I really the bad guy here? Had I gone too far by calling the police on my own brother? Every time I started to doubt myself, I would remember the look on Jake's face when he broke into my home, like he was entitled to everything I had. Over the next few days, I tried to go about my life as usual, but it was like living in a fog. I'd lost not only my parents, but the entire support system I'd grown up with. The phone calls from extended family stopped, the texts dried up, and the holiday invitations disappeared. I was officially the black sheep, the outcast who had betrayed his own blood. But as painful as it was, I knew deep down that I had done the right thing. I couldn't keep sacrificing my own well-being for the sake of family loyalty that only went one way. It was time to break the cycle of enabling and codependency, no matter the cost. Just when I thought things couldn't get worse, I received a call from my company's HR department. They had been informed about Jake's criminal record and my involvement in the case. Someone, likely one of my relatives, had tried to sabotage my career out of spite. They were investigating whether my association with Jake could jeopardize my security clearance. It felt like a cruel joke, like I was being punished for finally standing up for myself. I had fought so hard to distance myself from Jake's mess, only to have it come back to haunt me in the worst possible way. But I wasn't going to give up. Not now. Not after everything I had been through. I would fight to keep my job, my security clearance, and the life I had built for myself, even if it meant burning every last bridge with my family. The question was, how far was my family willing to go to drag me back down into the chaos I had fought so hard to escape? After that confrontation with my mother, I was ready to wash my hands of the entire family saga. I focused on work, trying to stay under the radar, while HR continued their investigation into my association with Jake's criminal activities. Every day, I held my breath, waiting for the dreaded call that could end my career. It was like living with a ticking time bomb, but I tried to convince myself that everything would blow over soon. Then, out of the blue, my phone rang late one evening. I didn't recognize the number, but something told me I should answer. On the other end was a voice I hadn't heard in years, my father. He was never the type to call unless something was seriously wrong, so I braced myself for whatever drama was coming my way. "Hey, it's Dad," he began, his tone unusually soft, almost apologetic. For a split second, I wondered if he was finally calling to mend fences, to admit that maybe, just maybe, they had been wrong to take Jake's side. But that hope was dashed almost immediately. "Your mother's really not doing well," he said, his voice thick with something I couldn't quite place. "She's been in and out of the hospital since your brother's arrest. The stress, It's just too much for her. She's asking for you. She wants to see you, to talk things out. I stood there, gripping the phone so hard my knuckles turned white. Was this another manipulation tactic? A last-ditch effort to guilt-trip me into dropping the charges or paying for Jake's lawyer? I couldn't tell. But despite everything, I couldn't ignore the part of me that still cared about my mother, the part that ached to believe that maybe there was a chance to repair our fractured relationship. "What does she want, Dad?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. "Is this about Jake? Because if it is, I'm not getting involved. I won't drop the charges, and I'm not going to pay a cent for his legal fees." There was a long pause on the other end, the kind of silence that stretches on just long enough to make you uncomfortable. Finally, he sighed, and I could almost hear the years of disappointment and resentment in that single breath. "It's not about Jake," he finally said. "She just wants to see you. Please, for her sake, just come to the hospital." Against my better judgment, I agreed. Maybe I was naive, or maybe I just needed closure, a way to put this whole nightmare behind me. Either way, I found myself driving to the hospital the next morning, my mind racing with what-ifs and worst-case scenarios. When I arrived, my father was waiting for me in the lobby. He looked older, more worn down than I remembered. It was as if the years of enabling Jake's behavior had taken a toll on him, too. He led me to my mother's room without saying much, just a few awkward comments about the weather and traffic. I could tell he was uncomfortable, like he was bracing himself for another blowout argument. When I walked into the hospital room, I barely recognized her. My mother looked frail, almost shrunken, like all the life had been drained out of her. It was a stark contrast to the fiery woman who had cursed me out just weeks ago. Her eyes flickered open when she saw me, and for a moment there was a flash of something. Maybe relief, maybe regret. "Thank you for coming," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "I know we've asked too much of you, but Jake he's still your brother. We're family, and families forgive." I felt my resolve wavering, but I reminded myself of all the chaos Jake had caused, all the sacrifices I'd made to distance myself from his toxic orbit. "Mom, I'm sorry you're going through this, but I can't help him. Not this time. He needs to learn, and I can't keep cleaning up his mess." Her eyes filled with tears, and she reached out, grabbing my hand with a surprising amount of strength for someone who looked so weak. "If you don't do this, you'll lose us," she said, her voice cracking. "You'll be alone. Are you really willing to throw away your family over this?" That hit me harder than I expected. The fear of being alone, of truly cutting all ties with the only family I had ever known, gnawed at me. But then I remembered the footage from my Tesla, the blatant disregard Jake had for my home, my safety. I thought of the sleepless nights, the constant anxiety of losing my job because of his actions. I couldn't go back to that life of walking on eggshells, constantly worrying about what disaster Jake would drag me into next. "I'm sorry," I said, pulling my hand away. "I can't do it. I won't." The look she gave me was pure devastation, like I had just ripped her heart out. I almost faltered, almost took it all back, but I stood my ground. For the first time in my life, I chose myself over them. I turned to leave, but just as I reached the door, my father's voice stopped me. "If you walk out now, don't bother coming back," he said coldly. "You're dead to us. You're not our son anymore." I paused, my hand hovering over the door handle. A part of me wanted to turn around, to beg for their forgiveness, to pretend that everything could go back to the way it was. But I knew better. I knew that if I gave in now, I'd be trapped in their cycle of enabling and guilt forever. So I walked out. I didn't look back. I didn't say goodbye. And as the door clicked shut behind me, it felt like the final nail in the coffin of my old life. For the first time, I was truly alone. No family, no support system, just me and the consequences of my choices. But for the first time, I also felt free. Walking out of that hospital felt like the longest journey of my life. Each step echoed with finality, a heavy reminder that there was no turning back. I was truly severing the last ties with my family, a decision I never thought I'd have to make. As I stepped into the cold, sterile air of the hospital parking lot, it hit me. I was completely alone now. No family dinners, no holiday gatherings, no phone calls from my parents, nothing. It was just me, standing in the middle of an empty parking lot, facing the consequences of my choice. I drove home in silence, my thoughts a chaotic storm of doubt and resolve. Had I made the right decision? Was I too harsh, too stubborn in my stand against Jake? But every time I replayed the break-in footage in my mind, the image of him rifling through my things with a smug sense of entitlement, I knew I couldn't go back. I had sacrificed so much already, my peace, my security, my career stability. I couldn't sacrifice myself any longer for the sake of family loyalty. Back at home, I tried to pick up the pieces of my shattered life. The investigation at work eventually concluded, and to my immense relief, my job was safe. HR ruled that I had acted responsibly by cutting ties with Jake and reporting his crime. But the damage was done. I could feel the shift in how my colleagues looked at me. The whispers, the sidelong glances, they all knew the story by now. I was the guy who turned his brother into the cops. The betrayal was like a brand, marking me as someone who put principles above blood, and not everyone respected that. A few weeks passed, and I settled into my new normal, trying to adjust to a life without my family. That's when I got the letter. It was from Jake, sent from the county jail, where he was awaiting trial. I hesitated before opening it, my heart pounding with a mix of anger and curiosity. What could he possibly have to say to me after everything? The letter was surprisingly short, barely a page long, but the words cut deep. Jake didn't apologize, didn't take any responsibility for what he'd done. Instead, he accused me of being a heartless bastard, of betraying the family, of ruining his life. "You're no better than the people who abandoned us," he wrote. "You turned your back on me, just like everyone else did. You're dead to me." I crumpled the letter and threw it in the trash. I thought it would hurt more, but it didn't. I guess I had reached a point where nothing Jake said or did could affect me anymore. He had taken everything he could from me, my trust, my sense of family, even my peace of mind. But this letter, this desperate attempt to shift the blame, was just another reminder of why I had to walk away. Days turned into weeks, and soon enough, Jake's trial date arrived. I had been subpoenaed as a witness, given the evidence I had against him. Walking into that courtroom was like stepping into a nightmare, facing my own brother from the witness stand. Jake looked gaunt, his cocky demeanor stripped away. For a brief moment, our eyes met, and I thought I saw a flicker of regret, maybe even fear. But it vanished as quickly as it came, replaced by that familiar glare of resentment. The trial was swift. With the video evidence, there was little room for doubt, and Jake's prior criminal record didn't do him any favors. The judge handed down a stiff sentence: 5 years in state prison for felony theft and breaking and entering. As the verdict was read, I felt a strange mix of emotions: relief, sadness, even a tinge of guilt. This was my brother, after all. But he was also the man who had pushed me to the brink, who had forced me to choose between my own life and the twisted version of family loyalty that my parents upheld. After the trial, my parents cut off all contact. True to their word, I was dead to them. I tried reaching out once, leaving a voicemail for my mother, hoping she might understand why I did what I did, but I never heard back. In their eyes, I was the villain, the son who had betrayed them. It didn't matter that I had tried to help Jake, to set boundaries that could have saved us all from this mess. They had chosen their side, and it wasn't mine. Months turned into a year, and I started to rebuild my life. I threw myself into my work, focusing on projects that took me out of town, away from the lingering shadows of my past. I made new friends, found new hobbies, even started dating again. For the first time in years, I felt a sense of peace, of freedom. I wasn't constantly looking over my shoulder, waiting for Jake to show up and ruin everything. I wasn't answering calls from my parents demanding that I fix the unfixable. But every now and then, in the quiet moments between work and sleep, I'd think about my family. I'd wonder if my parents ever regretted their choices, if they miss me as much as I miss the idea of what we could have been. I'd think about Jake, locked up, probably still blaming me for everything that went wrong in his life. But those thoughts would pass, like dark clouds drifting across a clear sky, and I'd remind myself of the hard truth I had learned. Sometimes, walking away is the only way to survive. Now, I live my life with a new set of boundaries. I've built walls that are hard to scale, and I don't let just anyone in. It's a lonely way to live, but it's safe. I've learned to be my own support system, my own family. And if there's one thing I've taken from all this, it's that family isn't just about blood. It's about the people who stand by you when everything falls apart. And sometimes, those people aren't the ones you were born with. For anyone out there struggling with toxic family dynamics, I'm here to tell you, it's okay to walk away. It's okay to choose yourself. Because at the end of the day, you have to live with your choices, not them. And sometimes, choosing yourself is the bravest thing you can do.